Okay, how's that? Okay, very good, thank you. I'm John Pound of the Art Committee, and I'm here attempting my usual impossible thing of giving an introduction to someone who needs no introduction. Rebecca Albiani is a favorite here, always a delight and a pleasure when she comes to share her extensive knowledge of art history with us. And this year, to get our Gallery Talks program off the ground in the new Anderson Hall, she agreed to give us a mini-series of our own. In January, she gave us a memorable introduction to Peggy Guggenheim. Well-deserved. Yeah. And today she is here to give us stories about how creativity and vitality thrive even under adversity, with the tales of two groups, or two Alabama artists, the Quilters, the abstract Quilters of Cheese Bend, and the narrative art of the lesser-known Bill Traylor. Before we let her start, however, one housekeeping note. This is a masks on affair, so please keep your mask on and up, except for the speaker. And when it comes to question and answer at the end, if you would wait for the microphone and keep your mask on and up, wait for the microphone, and then speak directly into the microphone, your courtesy would be appreciated. One other note, we will be re-showing this on HHTV next Sunday at 7:30. So now, Rebecca, it's yours. Thank you.
We like to look down on Alabama. Those of us up here in our literate, cultured Pacific Northwest tend to look unfavorably on Alabama for its poverty, its educational deficits and the like, and of course its rich history of racism, which Robert Indiana captured in this 1965 canvas. However, as we'll see today, despite that poverty and racism, Alabama has been home to a very rich tradition of folk art, including the work of Bill Traylor and of the Cheese Bend Quilters. This is Traylor himself working in his Montgomery, Alabama neighborhood at the age of about 93. And this may represent his earliest self-portrait from either 1939 or 1940. Bill Traylor was born into slavery in Dallas County, here, and his owner was George Traylor, but he was acting as the trustee for the property of his brother's children. And until they turned 18, George Traylor had possession of Bill Traylor and his family. So he's born, we are pretty sure, in 1853, although the records are scant for those born into slavery. And unusually, the original owner's will stipulated that his brother not break up the slave families that he was holding in trust for those nieces and nephews. And so Traylor's family was not split up, as was so common under slavery. However, in 1863, when the Emancipation Proclamation was announced, Traylor and his family were moved from the George Traylor plantation to the John Traylor plantation kind of across the river in Lowndes County. And that is where he would live and work for much of the rest of his life. So once slavery ended, Bill Traylor stayed on as a sharecropper. It was illegal to learn to read as a slave, but he never acquired that ability later in life either. And you can see, I mean, this is today. You can see still how rural, how unpaved this part of the country was. At the end of the century, after the death of his second wife and those of his white people, in other words, the descendants of the Traylors, the owners that he had grown up with, he left Lowndes County and moved to the outskirts of Montgomery, where he would work on a plantation for another many years before finally moving into Montgomery itself. But he begins his art career when he is homeless. He is sleeping in an undertaker's business. And this is the portrait that he made of Mr. Ross, the undertaker, David Calloway Ross, one of the owners of this funeral home, whom Traylor said would come down the stairs every morning and check in the coffins to make sure they were still empty. In other words, he had a deep superstition that ghosts might have moved in over the night. And Traylor depicts this prosperous black businessman of Montgomery, Alabama, with his little bag that the undertakers carried, with his hat, and with his colorful shirt front there, the only nod to individuality. So Traylor got by with whatever jobs he could pick up, and in 1939 he was selling pencils on a street corner, and seems to have started drawing, just using his own stock, and whatever paper he had at hand, and he began drawing, and he was noticed by a young white Alabama artist, Charles Shannon, who made a series of photographs of him. Shannon was a progressive artist who decried racism and Alabama's dark, ugly history. And he was part of a group of Alabama artists who had formed a collective they called New South. And there was WPA money in these years to open art centers in places that were not furnished with such things. And so they opened a New South Art Collective in Montgomery, which would give Bill Traylor his really first and only one-man show during his lifetime. This is the very work that he is working on in this photograph. It's pencil drawing. It's made on repurposed card. That is, if you turn this over, there's a poster for chewing tobacco on the other side. He would use the insides of boxes, whatever he could find. And you see that there are identifiable or familiar to Traylor animals like the goat. There were still goat carts on the streets of Montgomery, Alabama in the 30s. But the camel and the lion he probably got from newspapers. And then there is a figure, perhaps a self-portrait with a cane in the upper right, but possibly as the recipient of some sort of violence from the kind of triangular figure just behind him. And Shannon asked Traylor how long he had been drawing in 1939. And Traylor said he just started. And scholars think this is probably true, because his earliest works are pretty simple and tentative, like this lamp bottle cat. Traylor did not title his work, but sometimes Shannon, who would eventually collect over 1,000 of Traylor's works, sometimes he gave these works a title. So this is another one of those very early Traylors. You see familiar household objects, kettle, buckets, and so forth. But then look at the bottom, and we have narrative entering Traylor's art. We have violence entering as well, a horse that has bucked off its rider that falls haplessly there at the bottom. So before long, Traylor is incorporating scenes from his everyday life and then scenes from his 80-some years. So just doing the math, he's roughly 86 when he begins his career as an artist. So this is a blacksmith shop. And on the bottom row, and this is an irregular piece of paper, and Traylor is always so attentive to the edges of the paper. His figures will accommodate the edges just beautifully. So we find on the right two men shoeing a mule. We find in the center bottom a familiar figure from the neighborhood, a double amputee who got around on a kind of sledge with these metal things that the blacksmith had made for him. So this is an identifiable figure along with all of the tools of a blacksmith's top. But up at the top, where there's not a rug, but rather a torn space on this piece of paper, we have a scene that looks like a violent one. There is a man drinking and another man attacking him with a hammer. So within Traylor's art, there is often implicit or explicit violence taking place. Now, Charles Shannon was so impressed by Traylor that when they were decorating this New South Art Center, he made a mural of Traylor sketching. And the other artist involved in the project made an image of a young black man breaking his chains. So these were young artists with progressive ideas, and in February 1940, they hung a show of Traylor's work, which was photographed by two of the other members, Jean and George Lewis. And so they hung it thematically. This wall, you can see, had animals on it. You can see an elephant, a bull, some turtles, a chicken, which we'll see in a moment. Another wall had single figures. Another wall had two figures. Some had constructions and exciting events. Of course, no one bought any of this work. And they brought Traylor to the exhibition. It took him half an hour. The gallery was on the 3rd floor. And he was elderly and disabled. It took him half an hour to get to his show, and he wasn't impressed by it at all. This is one of the works that may have been in it. There were other drinkers that were definitely in it. So as far as the dates go, if it's dated 39 or 3940, it was in the show, and we have a date. It had to have been made by February 1940. Most of the rest of his work is dated 39 to 42 42 was the year Charles Shannon was drafted. And he did return after the war, but didn't feel any of Traylor's later work was as good, so he didn't collect it. So basically all we have is what Charles Shannon and a few other members of New South and random passerbys who gave him a nickel on the street managed to collect. But look at this drinker. Look at the joie de vivre that we get from this figure, this undulating, marvelous figure that is reminiscent of Picasso's acrobats, in the sureness of the contour line, in the way that the frame bounds and contains the figure. Some works, like the Red Man, have space in places where it adds to the expressive quality of the work. So this Red Man, another drinker with a pipe, he's crouching down, and there's lots of space above him, so that gives him room should he spring up. By this time, the poster paint is being supplied by Charles Shannon. He was bringing art supplies, colors rather than just the pencils, and art paper, but Traylor didn't like the paper and would not use it until he aged it. He left it out on the street corner with him for a few months until it had that ripe quality that he preferred. Should we switch, Mike?
I think I just keep hearing that humming.
Yeah, I'm hearing
Driving me
too.
nuts. Judy, is that microphone on? Is that microphone on, Nancy, or off? Is everybody's hearing aids working? Okay, I keep hearing a humming. I don't know what it is.
Am I approaching something too close, or? Okay, because I'm hearing it too. Like that.
Yeah, but I don't think it's the microphone. I think it's actually someone's hearing aid. That's what I think.
Okay. So some of Traylor's figures seem to be taken from folk religion in the South. This one, scholars tell us, is a depiction of a Haitian figure, Papa Legba, who comes from the West African Eshu, or Legba, god of crossroads between the human and spirit realm. He's described as having spidery hands and a hunched back, smoking a pipe, wearing a straw hat, hobbling with one leg stuck out at an angle like a duck's foot. Elusive, a trickster, someone Traylor might in fact have identified with. We think Traylor was a drinker because he once told Charles Shannon that any sense he ever had, whiskey took it away. This is a figure that closely resembles this figure from the voodoo tradition, drawn from African religion, diffused in the black areas of the American South. And it's thought by some scholars that Traylor himself might have been a root worker, a conjure doctor, someone practiced in these traditions. So Traylor's men and Traylor's women look a little different. Traylor's women are more solid. They are more upright, well, except for that drinker we saw, but in general, they're more upright. Here he has used the copyright on the paper as a belt buckle for this woman's skirt. And she's responsible. She's carrying a purse, she has a child that she is leading. So Traylor had fun doing colors and patterns. He must have been amazed by the array of women's fabric in Montgomery. When he depicts a man and a woman, though, they are almost always arguing. Traylor himself was married 3 times. He told Shannon things like, you know, she's pointing to where he's been. He's been running around on her, and she's pointing to where he's been, and he's trying to defend himself. But in one scholar's interpretation, the man with the shirt front is actually Death, Baron Somdi from Haitian religion. Wore that kind of all-black suit with a bosom shirt. So we may never know exactly what Traylor was thinking about as he was designing these works of art. For instance, when he made one of his works similar to this one, he told Charles Shannon that it was such a beautiful day, kind of like today, that he just wanted to be plowing. And he was very familiar with the farm equipment, having worked first as a slave, then as a sharecropper for decades on farms. He knew mules, he knew horses, he knew all of the trapping, and all of these harness lines go to the right places. He knew chickens. But it's such a wonderful chicken, right? And it is a yellow chicken, and for some scholars it's not just a chicken, but it's a chick. It's a woman that is strutting her stuff in this image. Pigs were another farm animal with their curly tails that Traylor loved to depict. Here on an unusually long, narrow piece of paper, he creates a somewhat longer than ordinary pig. And dogs form a part of Traylor's work, quite a significant one. This is the first Traylor I ever saw in person. It was at the Frye Art Museum in the Black Refractions show from the Studio Museum in Harlem. And it's tiny. It's only 8 by 8 inches, and yet even surrounded by the works of Jacob Lawrence and other great artists, this held its own on its little piece of wall. It was a memorable image. This dog is almost licking the edge of the paper. It's a friendly dog. It's on the back of a Hershey's chocolate box. But some of Traylor's dogs are fighting, some of them are ferocious, and this enormous dog with sharp teeth is being led by a white man. And here I think we get some of that resonance of slavery, of a white owner who uses the threat of violence, whose big stick is literally a big dog, to keep the African Americans in his employ, on his land, under control. Now, Traylor was very close-mouthed about exactly what he was doing in some of his scenes. As one contemporary black critic has written, quote, Taylor's doing something within the work that's meant to represent black people being very confrontational at a time when that was an invitation to annihilation, end quote. In other words, Traylor himself and other black men living in the South had to be deferential. They couldn't be martial. They couldn't be aggressive. They couldn't be confrontational, or they might end up hanging from a tree. And yet Traylor plays things out in his art that he never fully explained. So there are a series of works that Charles Shannon would ask, so what's this? And Bill Traylor would respond, oh, that's an exciting event. Often those exciting events involve a potential theft. Maybe this man has stolen that bottle of whiskey, and a chase, violence. There's someone coming after him, again, with a raised hammer or hatchet. A dog is chasing after him. Women are pointing and waving their canes. And through it all, an old bent man walks along the lower edge. Maybe Traylor himself, and all of these things are playing out in his memory. Another exciting event has severed heads up at the top. A plow, a snake. People are chasing a rabbit which was a symbol within the Brer Rabbit stories, within black culture at this time, a symbol of wiliness, of the slave's ability to escape punishment. We find hounds chasing the rabbit, people chasing the rabbit. Often there is someone with a weapon that is involved with this chase. And in this one, we see a house. And the house is clearly owned by a white man. How do we know this man is white? Certainly not by his color. But what's he holding? He's holding a book. For Traylor, that rectangle with an A, B, sometimes a C, is a symbol of literacy, something Traylor never possessed. So outside, there's someone else, also probably a white man with a gun, with a dog, but there's someone on the roof, maybe stealing a chicken. And that chicken theft occurs again and again in Traylor's work, as if, again, these are childhood memories, recollections of things that happened under slavery that are played out again and again in his art. So at the top of this kitchen scene is an interior, a woman lighting a lamp, a dog under a table, a potbelly stove and a kettle. But at the bottom, we find that yellow house again, and we find the, this time the chicken has achieved monumental proportions, looking more like a turkey or something. But again, being purloined and the perpetrator being chased with weapons, with dogs, and so forth. Some of Traylor's work involves what he called a construction. And he told Shannon that there was a kind of a diving platform near the river where he grew up, and the kids would jump into the river to cool off after a day working in the sun. Scholars have recognized things like cotton screws, implements of the cotton trade in Traylor's constructions, but we also see in a work like this, blue construction, with black and orange people, we see another theme that recurs in Traylor's art, the theme of balance. How to keep one's self, one's life in balance in a society that makes it very, very difficult for people of color to get a fair shake. And we see that effort at balance again in this marvelous man with cane on construction with dog, where we get the marvelous Traylor figure with its kind of sinuous form, balancing on this construction. And it looks a little different depending on how you could place this. You could tilt it a few degrees that way and place the bottom edge flush to the horizon. The dog and the shape, the irregular shape of the paper, and that round part that looks like the moon, right? But it's part of the piece of paper that Traylor chooses to make this work on. And we get this sense of this, this effort to keep in balance, to keep from falling, to keep everything from tumbling down, and the weight that was always pressing down on poverty-stricken African Americans in the South. Here, man carrying dog on object. Now he's carrying what looks like an anvil. There's something enormous and heavy. And then a dog on top of that, all of it fitting underneath the 137 that is already part of the paper that he's working on. So Traylor, in this short period between 1939 and 1942, just is pouring out image after image, painting after painting, including this Black Jesus, which was actually a theme being explored by very well-educated Black poets like County Cullen, members of the Harlem Renaissance, but Traylor too sees the logic of likening Jesus's crucifixion to the torments of Southern blacks, to the lynchings, to the sufferings and the sacrifices. And Traylor's own son was lynched, was killed extrajudicially by policemen in Birmingham. They claimed he was robbing a house. They claimed he had, a pistol. That was, of course, never brought into evidence or returned to the family. There was no investigation. 2 white policemen killing a black man in Birmingham was not news in the early 1930s. And so a couple of Traylor's works seem to at least approach the topic of lynching. Here, where the figure on the left could be hanging from that tree, where we get armed white men threatening, and again, dogs threatening the figure in the tree, or this untitled work, where 2 men are clearly hanging from some sort of ropes, and the fact that their heads are white has been interpreted as the life has drained out of them, or is draining out of them. And the horror on the looks of, on the faces of the onlookers. There was no market for a work like this. Nobody was asking for this, no one was buying it, just as there was no market for Francisco Goya's Disasters of Wars, war series that he made during the Napoleonic Wars on the Iberian Peninsula, but did not even print during his lifetime, this series of etchings. And in 1946, a journalist wrote an article using that photograph of Traylor in his daughter's backyard working. He lost his unemployment benefits when the agency discovered he had a daughter living in Montgomery. They made him live with her, despite the fact that they did not get along and his daughter was hostile to his art making. But here he is working on that art that when he visited, Charles Shannon felt was not good enough to collect any of the post-1942 art. And the article that accompanies this was patronizing and racist. One of the quotes from it is, quote, "Through some capricious blunder of the centuries, this old plantation Negro is painting like the prehistoric cave artists," end quote. And it negates any of Traylor's own experiences or any of the ways in which his art is about living in the good old red, white, and blue of 1930s and 40s and 20s and 10s and so forth, but America in the South in the Jim Crow era. Traylor died in extreme poverty in 1949 at the age of about 96. Had Shannon not collected his work, it probably would have fallen into complete obscurity. Some 40 years later, Shannon began to catalog the work, adding remembered titles, and began to give it to institutions like the Folk Art Museum and the Metropolitan Museum of Art, so that Traylor's work would become known to the broader public. Now, while Traylor was working in Montgomery, there were a group of women artists who were working in Gee's Bend, Alabama. So just one county over from Dallas County, where Traylor was born, is Gee's Bend, Boykin, Alabama, and the bend is this almost U-turn that the Alabama River makes in this part of Alabama, which makes Boykin one of the most isolated parts of the country. The nearest town of any size is Camden, and there was a ferry, but if the ferry were not running, it's a 40-mile drive around the bend to get to Camden. So it was really remote, really isolated, extremely poor, and in the 1930s, during the Depression, cotton prices plummeted, which meant that any occupation that there had been was now gone. And nearly all of the inhabitants of Gee's Bend were the descendants of the original slaves, first on the Joseph G. plantation established to grow cotton in 1816, and then he sold it to the Petway family. They owned 100 slaves surnamed Petway, and we'll find many Petways still living and working in Gee's Bend, like Jorina Petway, whom we see here in the center. So the WPA purchased large tracts of land in Gee's Bend so that the poor families that had been sharecropping this land could own it and could work it for their own benefit, and they built new houses. This is not one of the new houses. The Roosevelt houses, as they were called, did not need to have newspaper plastering the walls to keep the wind from blowing through the chinks, but also for a kind of decoration. So you'll notice how dirt poor these people are, and yet that they are sitting on a beautiful quilt. Because that was the glory of Gee's Bend. The women there had been quilters from time immemorial. And here we see Lucy Mooney sewing a quilt with two of her granddaughters. So the older generation passed on these skills to the younger ones. The WPA encouraged this. They brought in fabric. And they made sure that the young girls were trained in using modern sewing machines and so forth. But there was already this proud tradition of quilt making in Gee's Bend. So this is the earliest quilt that I was able to find that was documented. It's from the 1920s, made by Henrietta Petway, and it's what's known as a housetop variation, which is this kind of around in a square composition of fabric. This, you can see, is made out of old clothes. You can see the pockets in at least 3 places. The deeper blue denim of the pockets. You can see places where there are holes worn in the quilts. And the bands don't line up perfectly. And in some cases, she doesn't have enough fabric to do a whole band. So she will do different fabrics because she is working with what she had. Lucy Mooney made this quilt around 1935, and again, it is made from bits and pieces of fabric that were so worn out that they could, so stained, so patched, that they were no longer useful for clothing. But to turn them into quilts meant cutting them into strips that are not necessarily regular sizes. And the piecing was done alone by each artist, each quilter. The quilting was done communally. Some of the houses had quilt frames that were attached to the ceiling, and they would lower them down in the periods of the year where there wasn't much to do agriculturally. Then the women would quilt. So you see the beautiful quilted designs, the white thread of the quilted designs, and they used the cotton that they grew. They would pound the dust out of the cotton and use it to fill the quilts. Missouri Petway's Blocks and Strips work clothes quilt was made after the death of her husband in 1941. Her daughter, Arlonzia, described that when her daddy died, after being sick for about 8 months, her mother said, quote, "I'm going to take his work clothes, shape them into a quilt to remember him, and cover up under it for love," end quote. So her daughter helped her tear up his work clothes. And you can see that they are stained, they are patched, that these are used items of fabric, but they are put to, so the colors are mostly dull ones, but interestingly the overall palette is that red, white, and blue with a lot of gray. So they tore them in as even strips, perhaps, as they could, given the fact that they're sleeves and pant legs and so forth. I just want to compare a Gee's Bend quilt on the right with an Amish quilt on the left. So the Amish quilt is symmetrical, perfectly symmetrical. Its lines are straight. The quilting is done, I don't know if you can see the pattern of the quilting, but it's sort of like a feathered garland that wanders around the edges of the quilt. It's exquisite, and it's beautifully designed. But the Gee's Bend quilt has an energy and an individuality that the Amish quilt does not. It's not made out of new fabric. Most quilts aren't. And throughout history, most quilts have been made from nice new fabric, but not African American quilts. They are made from jeans, denim, whatever fabric could be spared, whatever they could get their hands on. And it's believed that during slavery, enslaved women made quilts for their masters. And that those quilts would have had every stitch in place, every bar lined up perfectly, that they would have been absolutely symmetrical and perfect, otherwise the women would have been punished for their transgressions, and that may be behind the impulse in the Gee's Bend quilts to have things not line up, to have things refuse to line up. Nettie Young began this quilt when she was 11. And you can see that some of it is an animal fabric, this bighorn sheep along the left edge, and other fabrics that she had been collecting for a couple of years by the time she started piecing that quilt. Every time there was a little bit of fabric left over from a project or another, she grabbed it so that she could begin this stacked bricks quilt, and that refers to the pattern of the squares that she uses. So very frequently the Gee's Bend women use traditional quilt square patterns, but with their own twist. So this is a remarkable quilt made by Lucy Petway that is an almost literal map of part of the old Petway community. So the large housetop square at the top is the big plantation house. And below it are 4 field workers' cabins. Now, the old slave cabins, each one with a slightly different configuration. And then there are strips for dirt roads. On the right-hand side is the Alabama River, that blue strip. And on the left-hand side, the green strips, the strips with calico, with growing things, those are the fields. But the blocks that she uses are housetop and bricklayer, traditional quilt squares. Delia Bennett makes what's called a fractured medallion. So it is a housetop, but with a different design in the opposite corners, which gives it this almost pulsating energy. And she made this in about 1965, in February of which year Martin Luther King Jr. visited Gee's Bend, as he was encouraging Southern blacks to register to vote. And he told the residents of Gee's Bend that they were somebody, that their lives had merit. And this was so impactful on the Gee's Bend community. Some of the women began to follow the marches, to become involved in the civil rights movement. Many of them tried to register to vote. They had to go to Camden to register to vote, and no black person in Wilcox County at that time was registered to vote. And when the authorities realized that the Gee's Bend women were crossing the river to try to register, they shut down the ferry, forcing them to make that 40-mile detour, and yet they persisted. And it had such an enormous impact that A decade later, Irene Williams is still making this vote quilt, where the fabric includes this patterned cotton. I have a detail of that is printed with the word vote, vote, vote. And you can see that it's surrounding bits and pieces of old clothes, rags, pieces that have been torn up and interspersed. But it gives that pattern. Again, Lazy Girl is a block that's just parallel lines. There are housetops here, there are bricklayers here, but they are done in this very unique way. So at about the time that Martin Luther King visited, a white minister, an Episcopalian minister who was from the north, was visiting the community as well to get involved in the civil rights movement, and he saw some beautiful quilts hanging on a line, so he tried to go knock on the door of the adjoining house, and as he got to the door, he noticed a woman fleeing the back of the house and running into the woods because a white man was knocking on her door. And eventually he learned you need to gain the trust of someone in the community, but he did get to talk to the quilters, and he encouraged them to make quilts that he would take north and sold to support the civil rights movement. So he was involved in a show of these women's work in New York City. Lee Krasner, Jackson Pollock's widow, even came and bought a quilt. Herself an abstract artist, she was impressed by the power of these abstract quilts. So some of the women used these traditional patterns, and some of them innovated. So this is Essie Bindolph Petway when she is still about 17. And the top of the quilt looks like a lot of G's Bend quilts, with brilliant colors, lots of small pieces, nothing quite lining up. The back of the quilt looks like a minimalist painting. That blue and white pattern that starts with just a little white, and the white gradually increases. The minimalist grid, it's not dissimilar. So in the wake of the civil rights movement, the women of G's Bend and the surrounding area formed a sewing cooperative that they called the Freedom Quilting Bee. And in 1972, Sears Roebuck gave the Freedom Quilting Bee the contract to produce their corduroy pillow covers and cushions, which of course didn't allow these women the kind of creative scope that they had when they were quilt making, because they are making they're making squares, and they're making rocking chair backs and so forth. This is page 1,494 of the 1974 Sears catalog. I'm sure we all remember those catalogs. But these objects were made by the Freedom Quilting Bee in Alabama. And they were allowed to keep the scraps, which meant that there is now corduroy in these colors of tangerine and goldenrod and avocado that the quilters can now use in their work. And corduroy was not part of their work previously, but it's warm, it's durable, it's colorful, it's wonderful. So quilt makers like Willie Abrams begin to use these materials in works like this Roman Stripes quilt, or Rita Mae Petway's fractured medallion housetop where instead of the two opposite corners being a different pattern, it's the two adjoining corners. She has alternated the red, the cherry red, and the royal blue, but using Sears corduroy. Now, in 1993, photographer Roland Freeman made this image of Annie Mae Young with quilts and her great-granddaughter. And you can see that the quilt on the right is a more conventional one, but the one on the left is that rather remarkable one that we saw earlier. And 5 years later, an Atlanta collector named Bill Arnett saw this photograph in a book. And he decided he was going to go find this woman and buy that quilt. So he eventually found Annie Mae Young and showed her the photograph and asked about the quilt, and she said she wasn't quite sure she still had it. She might have burned it. And she went and she rummaged through, and sure enough, there it was, and it's in the Metropolitan Museum of Art now. Annie Mae Young has this very strong, sure sense of design. This is another of her quilts from about a decade later that is in the Seattle Art Museum collection. Well, Bill Arnett, a couple of years after that, was working at the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston when their autumn exhibition fell through. They were in a bind, and he proposed that they fill that space with an exhibition of Gee's Bend quilts. They didn't have a lot of other things, competing for this space, so he put together on the fly an exhibition of Gee's Bend quilts that was shown in Houston and then toured the country. Michael Kimmerman, writing in the New York Times, called the quilts, quote, "some of the most miraculous works of modern art America has produced." And stamps were even issued with Gee's Bend quilt designs. So these works began to be discussed in the same breath as Agnes Martin, as minimalism, as Barnett Newman. This is something I found on the Metropolitan Museum of Art website. Two works in their collection that they were comparing side by side. And Barnett Newman's work, of course, comes out from of a highly intellectual engagement with the whole history of Western art, and particularly with European modernism, whereas Loretta Petway's art does not have that kind of pedigree, but her sense of design is just as sure as his. So in one way, they're apples and oranges. It's not logical to compare works like this, but it is seductive to try to do so. And the works of the Gee's Bend quilters and of Bill Traylor have inspired a younger generation of artists. Kara Walker's silhouettes of life in slavery in the antebellum South are inspired directly by Bill Traylor's works. Although hers are, his danced around the edges. He would say this is an exciting event. Kara Walker is very direct and confrontational in her work. But these objects are still remarkably inspirational. And one of the most amazing things about them is that they exist at all. Despite poverty and homelessness, these artists persisted in taking what they had and turning it into something useful, meaningful, powerful, beautiful. And as the modern museum world endeavors to expand its reach from the privileged few to a broader swath of society, these things of beauty are becoming available to an even wider audience. Thank you. So are there questions or works you'd like a second look at?
Yeah, so I just wonder, did they realize financial benefits from all this discovery of their quilts, or did they get exploited?
So it's a really interesting question, both with Traylor and with the G's Bend quilters. Sometimes they did not reap any financial benefits, and of course Traylor himself died in extreme poverty. For instance, some of the quilts were sold during the civil rights movement that the women knew that they were making these quilts to go off to be sold to Northerners, but to help fund the civil rights movement. But then some of those quilts would then be turned over in the 80s and the 90s once they started becoming much more, well, in the 90s, when they became much better known, then they would be turned over on the secondary art market for much more than was ever paid for them. The artists didn't see any of that income. And Traylor's heirs, and I think also some of the G's Bend quilters, that there were lawsuits about this. Traylor's heirs sued Charles Shannon because they thought he had essentially stolen their grandfather's work. And then, as their lawyers did discovery and they learned, oh, actually he did pay for them what was considered a roughly fair price at the time, they did drop the lawsuit, and the heirs wrote that we have come to understand that that this was not exploitation, but it was deeply hurtful to Shannon, who saw himself as the savior of Traylor's work, to be accused of exploitation. On the other hand, exploitation in this kind of circumstance it's almost inevitable. Charles Shannon's girlfriend, later wife, said that she felt Bill Traylor was uncomfortable around women. Well, I wonder why an elderly black man in Jim Crow, Alabama would be uncomfortable around a white woman. So there were structures of power and privilege and race that made it very, very difficult to have a kind of fair and balanced recompense for these objects that were not seen as fine art objects by their makers, because their makers didn't really even know that the world of fine art objects existed, or that such a thing could be made by a poor black person in Alabama. So yes, it's an excellent question, and it has caused some tension. Yes, I see a question.
Has anyone done a study or anything on Will Arnett and his his influence on all of this outsider art?
Has anyone done a study on William Arnett, who's become a major collector of outsider art? I don't know. I know that he established the Souls Grown Deep Foundation. I wrote down even when, in 2010. And if you go to the Souls Grown Deep website, there are biographies of all of the Gee's Bend women quilters, and then of other artists that Arnett has been interested in and collected. And certainly there have been multiple museum exhibitions drawn from his collection that, each one will have an essay about his collecting activities, but I don't know if there's been a whole book about his career as a collector and his influence.
I read a book a number of years ago, and it was showing some wonderful quilts similar to these.
Mm-hmm.
They were very, very old quilts, and the person that was writing the book suggested that they originally were demonstrating different routes to escape from the south and go north. Have you heard anything about that theory?
Yes, it hasn't conclusively been proven, and those would have been quilts made by slaves during slavery. That supposedly, the theory is that some of them with stars and with particular markings on the quilts showed routes to safety, showed sort of the path on the Underground Railroad, which is a marvelous idea, but I'm not sure it has been completely substantiated. Does anyone know? Was that your follow-up question or comment?
The American Quilt Study Group has published a number of articles in their journal uncoverings, and there is absolutely no historical substantiation of that. It arose as a nice story.
Yeah, and it's a good story. It would make a good novel, but there's no evidence that it actually happened. Yes?
What about Gee's Bend today? Are there any quilters still quilting in
Yes,
that area?
about Gee's Bend today, yes, there are still quilters quilting in Gee's Bend, and in fact, not 100% of them are female. There are even a couple of men that have begun quilting in the tradition of their grandmothers and great-grandmothers. But yes, it's still an important part of the economy of Gee's Bend, and there are still quilters active. Other questions?
Turning to Bill Traylor, those exceedingly sharp noses on his character, do scholars trace those to any of the Haitian imagery, or is that pure Traylorism?
So it seems to be a Traylorism, and Traylor told Bill Shannon that if you put... Well, he told him a couple of things. He told him in terms of how to tell a white man from a black man in his work. So he said that if it was just an outline and not colored in, whether it was colored in red or blue or black, that was a white man. But he also said, and scholars have shown that pretty conclusively that it does not work 100% of the time, but he said that if you take a ruler and put it between the tip of the nose and the tip of the chin, and the lips touch, it's a black man, and they don't touch, it's a white man. But I think that would make most everyone in this image a white man, and I think that's unlikely. But yes, Traylor. And it's possible. There are, again, there's no proven evidence that Traylor was active in root work in hoodoo culture that comes out of that, Haitian influence. One scholar in particular believes that he was, but there's no evidence for it. So we don't know what he knew. We think that really he came up with most of this just out of his imagination. Other questions? Well, thank you so much for coming out to learn about some of the